You're listening to WMPG 90.9 Gorham, Portland. Live from the Orion Cygnus arm of the Milky Way galaxy, this is Scientifically Speaking, a weekly half-hour program devoted to elegant curiosities, and I'm Sarah Chang, one of your hosts. And joining me, as always, is Bernie Rhyme, DJ Starwatcher. How are you, Bernie?
Yes, hi Sarah, very good.
Bernie is our professor of the astronomy lab at USM and our protector of the local night skies. You can reach out to us at WMPG Scientifically Speaking at gmail.com or on Twitter at WMPG Sci Speak as well. Bernie,
Yes.
could you let our listeners know what's up in the night sky for this coming week?
Yes, okay, I will. Well, there was a highlight that was just over, this being Friday the 20th, so hopefully you saw a few of them. That would be the Leonid meteor shower. You might still be able to catch a few stragglers at this point. So that was close to the new moon, which is perfect. That's a good time to see meteors. So right now we have a waxing crescent moon, so it's 33% full. So it'll be up when it gets dark and it'll set right after sunset. So that's a nice time to get out in the sky and look for other things. Jupiter and Saturn are getting closer and closer every single night. You can certainly tell the difference already. And then Mars is coming up earlier. It's already up by the time it gets dark. It's still nice and red. It's still closer than usual. You can still see some detail in the telescope. And then Venus is up around 3 or 4 in the morning. And actually, Mercury is also making a morning appearance this month. I haven't seen Mercury, and so they're fairly close together in the morning sky. So, and there is a comet, actually, some friends in my astronomy club just showed me a picture, and you need binoculars, but it's right in Orion, near Orion's belt. It's called Comet Atlas. That may be a challenge. Just think about 8th magnitude for our listeners. If you have a pair of binoculars, you can see a comet right in the middle of Orion right now. I saw some.
Wow.
I haven't found it myself yet. Yeah.
Okay. What's the name of the comet?
Atlas, as in the hero
Atlas.
holding up the Earth. Atlas. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll have to check it out.
Yep.
Sweet. Thanks, Bernie.
Yeah, you're welcome.
If Bernie talked way too fast, you can also check out the monthly What's Up column in the Portland Press Herald for a more detailed scope of what's up in the night sky for the coming month. So today's episode is actually this last Wednesday, November 18th, this celebration of LGBTQ plus in STEM. And we thought that, we're 2 days late, but we wanted to dedicate this show to some people who you may not know, who identified LGBTQ and were just really outstanding in the sciences. And so we're going to highlight 4 people today. And so I wanted to also recognize that today, the 20th, is also Transgender Day of Remembrance. So we actually will have a couple of transgender folks that we'll be talking about today as well, and talking about their accomplishments. But the 18th was particularly symbolic because it is actually the 60th anniversary of an American astronomer and gay activist, Frank Kameni's U.S. Supreme Court fight against workplace discrimination. And obviously this fight still continues on today, but this was kind of really monumental, and he was a huge activist. So a little bit about Mr. Frank. So Frank was born on May 21st, 1925. And so he was an American astronomer. He graduated with a master's and a doctorate in astronomy. His doctoral thesis, Bernie, you'll be interested in this, was titled A Photoelectric Study of Some RV Tori and Yellow Semi-Regular Variables. And it was actually written under the supervision of Professor Cecilia Payne. For our listeners who still don't know our Harvard computers, she was actually the first woman to head a department at Harvard, and the first who proposed that stars were mainly made of hydrogen and helium. So anyways, he did his thesis under her supervision, which was really cool. And so he got his doctorate in 1956. So after that, he went on to teach astronomy at the Georgetown University's astronomy department, somewhere around 56, 57 as well. And then he was only there for a year and then was hired into the U.S. Army's Army Map Service as a kind of, I don't know, Army government astronomer, I guess is the official title. But then he was promptly fired a year later in January of 1958. And this was because there was an incident that had happened to him, I believe, somewhere in California a year or two before he started his professorship at Georgetown, where I guess he was groped. I don't quite remember the scenario, but for some reason there were like criminal charges filed against him. But then they promised that the criminal charges would be dropped, and so it wouldn't be, wouldn't count against him in terms of employment. But somehow the U.S. Army found out about it, and they somehow correlated that with him being gay, and so then he was barred from future employment and was fired. So he could no longer work in the federal government because of that. So he appealed his firing by the U.S. Civil Service Commission. So he wrote letters to the agency. He wrote to both houses of Congress and eventually the White House. He sued in lower courts, but he lost twice. And then he sought review by the U.S. Supreme Court, but was also turned down. So in total, it was like this 4-year legal fight against the idea that sexual orientation could make one unfit for federal service. And although the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear his case, it was also the first time that an equal rights claim had been made on the basis of sexual orientation. And so that that claim, the official letter or briefing or whatever you want to call it, that was actually dated November 18th, which is why the 60th anniversary of all that. And so after that, he really didn't do any more science. He got into advocacy. He didn't hold like a full-time paying job again after he was fired from the U.S. Army. And so he just continued to lobby government officials. He would testify in congressional committees, bring court challenges. He would picket the White House. And overall, he was just a really ardent activist for LGBTQ rights. And he actually later he was able to, with his allies, pressure the U.S. Civil Service Commission to abandon its policy of denying federal employment to homosexuals. He also was able to, or he led efforts to remove homosexuality as a basis for denying government security clearance. And he was involved in the first legal challenge to the U.S. military's policy of discharging gay and lesbian service members. And one of the most interesting ones was he also led efforts to redefine the American Psychiatric Association's definition of homosexuality as a mental illness. And so he died pretty recently, October 11th, 2011. And he's kind of a celebrated activist in the LGBTQ community. So that is kind of a little tidbit for why November 18th is so special for the LGBTQ community. And I also wanted to mention, if you want to check out more, I believe it's STEM in Science, or no, prideinscience.org. You can find more resources related to this and learn more about Frank as well. So, Bernie,
Yes.
who's one of the LGBTQ scientists that you learned about?
Yes. Okay, well, this person is much less famous, but still a very interesting story, like, a more average story that probably more people can identify with. Her name is Ruth Mills, and she's in England, United Kingdom, and she's probably about 45 years old. She hasn't completely finished her, she's trans, hasn't finished her whole transformation yet, but the picture of her showed her as a woman. So she works in IT, Java development in Birmingham, England. And she had an interesting history to get to that point. She went to Oxford, not a bad school for college. She has a master's in chemistry and computational chemistry and fluid dynamics.
Oh,
The most difficult equations, these are called the Navier-Stokes equations. and some of those remain on the one of the list of like 7 unsolved math problems in the world. So she was probably dealing with some of those. I'm not saying she solved it. She probably would have a Nobel Prize by now. Just to give our listeners an appreciation how difficult fluid dynamics is. I mean, air is actually about 1,000 times less dense than water, but this is more vicious fluids, like denser than water. But it's a whole interesting series of equations and dynamics. So she was really good at those type of things. And then she got into developing code, Java development. So she works for an IT company now. But what's interesting is kind of what her path was and who the people were that got her inspired to do this and to stay in that path. So when she was 11 years old, a friend of her father's was a Unitarian minister. So they're generally very open to, people with those, so that they feel very safe and welcome there. So this friend of her father's, who was a minister, gave her a computer when she was 11. So this was about 1983. So it's a Mattel Aquarius. I don't know if you heard of it, but that's like the English
No.
version of the Timex Sinclair 1000.
Oh.
That's a really, actually, I had one of those little Timex Sinclairs. My brother actually soldered some of the connections to try to improve what the computer could do. He was a little more mechanical than I was. It only had 4K of RAM, which is the same thing as the Aquarius. And she like wrote machine language to update what her little Aquarius computer could do. That I got her into code from being 11 years old. So that's pretty neat. So if you remember that, so the 4K of RAM, so now an average computer will have 4 GB of RAM, up to even 16 or 32 gigabyte. So that is 1 million times more. Just the random access memory is 1 million times more than it was back in the 80s. And the 80s isn't all that long ago.
Yeah.
Think of it music-wise. I mean, that's like recent music. But computer-wise, it's like the Dark Ages, the dinosaurs. So 4K of RAM was a big thing. So that got her into that. And then her uncle gave her a bunch of chemistry books. So that got her into chemistry. And so now she's doing a lot of interesting things. I mean, she loves coding, computer coding, writing language in C and, different languages, JavaScript and so on. But she now founded a local group of trans people in Birmingham. So she's inspiring them and to code. And so when she came out, she was a senior at Oxford College in 1996. So, of course, she was worried about career chances being hurt. Now, obviously, what happened to DeFrang, I mean, they could have been hurt. But she had very few negative experiences. I mean, she was still waiting until she became a senior. I mean, Oxford obviously is a great school. So then a friend kind of inspired her to come out, and she did that. And she still loves the hands-on and the technical aspects and helping others by starting this group. So I think it's a really good success story of someone that we really don't know much about. And I'm sure she's probably, I don't know what size her groups are, but there's a lot of people in Birmingham and England, and of course all over England and London, that are probably doing really good scientific work and that have overcome a lot of these issues, and they got inspired early when they were younger to do this, and they keep going with this. She may even want to become an architect and finish her transformation to a woman and that type of thing. So
That's awesome.
you're ahead of her.
Yeah. Say her name again.
Ruth Mills. Not
Ruth Mills.
say Janet Mills, no. Ruth Mills. Birmingham, England. She's not our governor, no. Ruth Mills.
That's awesome. Well,
Yeah.
thanks for talking about Ruth and sharing her story with our listeners.
Mhm.
So our the one of the other people that I researched was also a transgender scientist, and his name was Ben Bars, and he is known for being kind of the first openly transgender scientist in the National Academy of Sciences. Was probably one of the biggest, more renowned, I guess, awards, if you will, and that was in 2013. So he was a neurobiologist at Stanford University. It was kind of his primary career throughout the bulk of his life. So he was born female. His parents kind of always saw him as a tomboy. Throughout grade school, he was really gifted in the maths and sciences. He received his bachelor's in biology from MIT, medical degree from Dartmouth Medical School, did his residency in neurology at Weill Cornell Medicine, which is the biomedical research unit and medical school of Cornell. And during his residency, that's when he was like noticing that there was this huge gap in the understanding and knowledge of causes and cures of neurodegeneration. And so neurodegeneration is kind of this catch-all term for when there's just progressive loss of the ability of neurons to function as intended. This could generally kind of be loss of structure or function, but it could also be death of neurons. And a lot of common neurodegenerative diseases occur because of these neurodegenerative processes, and they're usually incurable. Pretty famous ones: Parkinson's, characterized by the death of dopaminergic neurons in the midbrain. So it's kind of like selective cell death. Alzheimer's, chronic neurodegenerative disease, where there's like loss of neurons and synapses in cerebral cortex. Huntington's disease, which is a lot rarer, but it's characterized by the loss of medium spiny neurons and the degeneration of the frontal and temporal cornices. And then ALS is targeted neurodegeneration of motor neurons. So kind of all really different. And that was kind of what he didn't study those diseases, but he was studying kind of why does neurodegeneration happen. And so during his residency, he would like study pathology reports. And then that's when he noticed, hey, seems like there's this correlation between neural degeneration and irregular patterns of glia cells in the brain. So, of course, right?
Boy,
he
that's how
quit.
everyone should know that.
So
Could
he
be a,
quit his residency and decided to pursue research in neuroscience at Harvard because that's so easy to do too. Um,
so anyone can do that.
anyone can do that. So he got his PhD and he continued postdoctoral training at the University College of London. Also, really easy. He joined the neurobiology faculty at Stanford School of Medicine in 1993. And his research centered around the study of glia cells of the central nervous system, understanding their function, how they developed, and much of his work, if you look for it, was published under Barbara A. Bars. So that was his original name. He studied vertebrate nervous system development, mainly to understand why kind of neurons might fail to survive and die at such tremendous scales. And he also discovered the importance of glia cells in the formation, development, maturation, and regeneration of neurons, and helped to develop methods for studying glial cells and interactions with other cells in the lab. So, as far as his kind of experience in, his gender identity and transitioning, he talked about how when he was at MIT pursuing his bachelor's in bio, he had experienced gender discrimination. So, one experience he talked about was he had solved a really difficult math problem that stumped many of his male peers, and his professor actually accused him that it was solved for him by a boyfriend.
Mm.
He lost a scholarship to a man who had only been published once compared to him who had been published 6 times. And so there was potential discrimination there. He didn't decide on transitioning actually until he was around 43 years old. And at that time, there were no role models. I think like it's really great that Ruth Mills is being a role model, but he didn't have any at the time. And kind of like Frank, he had to, well, I don't know, like Frank, but he had to decide between identity and career, right? I think for a lot of these people, they're like, oh, like if I just stay quiet about it, I won't risk my career. And so in 1997, he transitioned fully to male, and he actually noted that he was treated with much more respect from people who were unaware of his transgender status. And then there was this one time when he had delivered one of his first seminars as a man. He heard a comment from like somebody who had participated, who goes, "Wow, Ben Bars gave a great seminar today, but his work is so much better than his sister's," because they thought that Barbara was his
Sister.
sister.
That's good. The same person.
I know. And so he from then he did write and speak openly about science and sexism. And he shared work on being a trans man, experiences of gender identity, experiences of how he was treated as a female scientist versus as a male scientist. And he was often really, really critical of people who tried to like explain why there were fewer women who went into sciences and engineering due to less intrinsic aptitude. So he died pretty recently as well. He died on December 27th, 2017. And he had so many awards throughout his lifetime, like so many fellowships, so many scholar awards. He was elected Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And of course, he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences. For those who want to learn more, he gave this great speech or great talk called Some Reflections on the Dearth of Women in Science. That was given at Harvard University a few years back. So check that out. Ben Bars.
Mhm. Yeah.
So who is the second person that you looked up,
Yeah.
Bernie?
Okay, actually, before I get to this person, since you had covered him, I hadn't heard of him specifically, but I do have some friends that are in that field. I met them during the solar eclipse 3 years
Oh
ago.
yeah?
And yeah, they're a pair of German doctors, both husband and wife. They're both doctors and neuroscientists. And so at the time I met them, they were running an astrophotography place in Switzerland. They had given up their careers, and they're like in their 40s, probably in their 50s by now. And they were running this place for 10 years. I just checked out their website and I emailed them again. So, and they closed that just the beginning of this year, probably maybe because of COVID, I'm not sure why. And they're back doing research in California now in neuroscience. So I'm going to ask them if they knew this person or maybe they worked with him. That'd be an interesting connection.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So they were running seminars, and they have some great astrophotographs, including pictures of the eclipse that we both saw
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
on Idaho. And they had set up like 2 days early. I just walked. None of my group of 20 people walked out. It was only like 100 yards away, and I don't know why they weren't curious about what our neighbors were doing. And they had all hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment because they were running the huge place in Switzerland. But they were both German neuroscientists who had gone into astronomy, and now they're right back in neuroscience.
Should totally ask if they know him.
So they might know him.
Yeah.
Okay, so my other person is also fairly not so famous, not like either one of yours. So her name is Ashley Spindler. I'm also British. She's younger, probably in her 30s. But her topic, what she's studying, is really interesting. She's getting a PhD in astrophysics, which is perfect, from the Open University. So actually, I'd never even heard of this. This is the biggest university, like probably almost in the world. It has almost 200,000 students, and it offers
Oh.
different courses that you can take for free with accreditation. So that alone might be a good thing to offer for people in 8 different subjects. So she's finishing up her PhD candidacy in study of galaxy evolution. So she has master's degrees in physics, nuclear astrophysics, space technology, and planetary exploration. And now she's going on into her PhD in galaxy evolution. But what was neat about that is that she's been to the U.S. a few times to use some of the big telescopes, the Sky Survey telescopes, which is one of the labs I'm doing right now for my students. So that kind of tied in nicely. So I don't know if you heard of this observatory. It's at Apache Point in New Mexico. It's right near Roswell.
Mhm.
It's a famous place. So it has a 2.5 meter and a bunch of other telescopes used for the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. So she got to use this,
Oh.
study 10,000 galaxies at once. So she uses a different type of spectrometry than what I just introduced in my labs. It's called spatially resolved spectrometry, or SRS. It's much more detailed. It allows you to see things in much greater detail. Like for instance, I mean, I won't go into the technical things of it. I looked it up a little bit. So it kind of bundles all these fibers to do the spectrographs. So basically, they're bundled so she can look at 17 galaxies at once instead of just one to get the spectra. So you can do like 10,000 nearby galaxies, and I don't know how long she spent out there. So she was getting really good data to see how they evolve and how the environment within the galaxy would be friendly to star formation. Like I know some other
Wow.
PhD people that do molecular cloud development, or we just had a talk at my other club in Portland, and that was on how planets form around stars at the protodisk of stars. These are all somewhat related fields, and these are all PhD candidates. So that's what she's doing. But what inspired her is kind of interesting. Well, actually, first, she didn't come out until after she had said that she was applying for the PhD, in case that might have set her back. And I think she is
Yeah, yeah.
transformed into one, but she was playing, trying to save her career potentially. They said, no, you can't have a PhD because of that. So she's been on
Right.
now for a few years, and actually by now she may have already gotten that PhD. So then she might go either in postdoc or she might what she calls flee to the real world, but with a degree in because I have a friend, a PhD, who is doing postdoc work at the university in Ohio. He had studied at UMass Amherst. But so her inspiration was interesting. It wasn't like an early computer or a book on chemistry or something. It was actually a fictional character, Samantha Carter on Stargate SG-1. So I hadn't watched a lot of the Stargate. So this is a person, she was played by Amanda Tapping, who's a Canadian actress. But Samantha Carter was obviously, she wasn't a real person in that show, but there's lots of women like that, a lot of women astronauts, for instance. So she had PhDs in physics and engineering, and she was an Air Force pilot. And I mean, it just really sounds like some of the astronauts. So that character, even though obviously she knew she wasn't a real person, what really inspired her to get into astrophysics and so on. So that role model was Samantha Carter. So that was kind of interesting. Yeah, so basically that's what she did. So it doesn't really say, I don't think she probably didn't form any groups like Ruth Mills because she was probably busy full time up her PhD. But that university is near where Bletchley Park is, just maybe less than an hour north of London.
Yeah.
University is located.
And that's the tie with Alan Turing, right?
Yeah,
And I didn't know this. I
yeah.
know Bernie, you knew this, but maybe our
Mhm,
listeners didn't know this.
mhm.
Alan Turing he was a war hero and kind of a giant of computer science.
Yeah, he
But
helped break the code that
yep,
had Hitler lose the war. I mean, this was huge. It-
yeah, yeah.
it-
I mean, the Turing test is still used
for AI, yeah.
to this day. Yep,
Mhm,
which kind of determines if a computer is artificially intelligent.
mhm,
But he was also a gay man who simply just wanted to live freely. I think at the end, he was kind of really tormented
mm,
by the government. He was a gay man at a time when homosexuality was a crime. After a break-in, a home break-in, he basically had called the police, but then he had to like admit that he had sexual relations with the robber, who at the time was like this 19-year-old. And
mm,
so, even though he was a war hero, he was arrested. He had to admit to acts of gross indecency. He was given a
mm,
choice of either prison or probation. And if he went on probation, he had to go under kind of cruel chemical castration,
mm,
hormonal treatment to eliminate his libido, and also eliminate any potential gay urges. And so he actually chose the latter. And so it also meant that his security clearance, because he was working at GCHQ, which I don't actually know what that is, but some kind of government headquarters. He was banned from entering the U.S., and it essentially ended his career as he knew it. But he could continue some academic work. Um, so at age 41, he committed suicide,
mm,
and yeah, I think 13 years later there was some decriminalization of homosexuality,
mm.
but it wasn't until like 2009 did the government apologize for his treatment.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Just imagine all the other things he could have invented and come up with. The
right,
it could
right,
be further ahead, maybe even quantum computers could be further ahead by now and that type of thing. So,
yeah,
yeah. So that was the park. Bletchley Park is where they were breaking the codes. All the different codes came in. They ran them through this basically like a giant typewriter called Enigma. So they ran them through there. And of course, generally they would decode the messages just a little bit too late, but they wanted to learn the patterns. And then they eventually caught some of the Germans that weren't careful about resetting the codes. And they got a German submarine with one of the codes that were even more difficult codes. And then they could figure out where those submarines were. And then they eventually broke the codes that way. So,
wow,
and but to develop this Enigma machine, it was totally different from any other way that people were trying to break codes at the time. So he
yeah,
had a totally new idea. He built like a giant machine, and then they could run all this through there.
That's crazy.
Did a lot of other brilliant things too, but that's probably the main thing, basically, and to break the codes to end World War II. I mean, that's a pretty big achievement.
Yeah. You have been listening to another episode of Scientifically Speaking here on WMPG with myself and Bernie. Happy LGBTQ in STEM. Stay tuned for Sports Jam with Colin and Connor. And from your favorite nerds, mask up, and we wish you healthy bodies and clean air.